Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope you're having a great Miami Art Week and basiling all around town. I just wanted to make a quick announcement before we get started with our program. If you do have some headsets still with you, just go ahead and hang on to them until the end of today's conversation, and then we can return them back at the end. So just to mention that. Okay, do a little adjustment here. So again, welcome to the Perez Art Museum, Miami. My name's Marie Vickles. I'm the Director of Education, and I'm so happy to present one of our Miami Art Week education programs here today. Today's program, Marco Brambilla in conversation with Franklin Sirmans, provides an insider's view of Heaven's Gate, with a special conversation and opportunity actually for discussion as well with Marco Brambilla, the artist of Heaven's Gate, and PAMM director Franklin Sirmans. Heaven's Gate is a monumental new work by video artist Marco Brambilla, a lavish, satirical, and vertigo-inducing meditation on the Hollywood dream factory. Heaven's Gate is a work of digital psychedelia, employing the same state-of-the-art computer compositing technology as the film it references. Also, for those of you joining us on YouTube Live, thank you so much. It's only fitting that we have a program that is both in-person and virtual, especially in the times we now live in, and hopefully virtual will just become a thing that we do with all of our programs from here on out. So wherever in the world you're joining us from today, you can follow us online, PAMM.org. We have many of our programs, if not all of our programs, online now. So let me do some introductions of our wonderful speakers today. But before I do that, I would like to thank and acknowledge the amazing team of people that we have producing our education programs. Big thank yous to Anita Bram, Associate Director of Adult Programs and Audience Engagement, Janessa Mendez, our Education Associate, and our amazing AV and photo video team, Denise Vaxis, Andrew Bird, and Lazaro Yanis. Thank you so much. We could not do any of this without you, and as you all know, tech is ruling our lives now, so thank you again. Okay, now for our introductions. Marco Brambilla is no stranger to Hollywood, having directed the 1993 film Demolition Man, a sci-fi meditation on a dystopian future, perhaps one not unlike our own. He's based in London. His work has been internationally exhibited and is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Arco Foundation in Madrid, the Cochrane Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and many more. His work has been exhibited at the New Museum, New York, the Seoul Biennial in South Korea, Broad Art Museum, Borusan Contemporary in Istanbul, the Kunsthalle Bern, Switzerland, and others. His retrospective took place at the Santa Monica Museum of Art, and he has worked with Creative Time and Art Production Fund in New York to present public art installations, including his Nude Descending Staircase No. 3 in 2019, presented at Oculus WTC by Art Production Fund during Frieze, New York. Brambilla is a recipient of the Tiffany Comfort Foundation and the Tiffany Colbert Foundation Awards. His work has been featured at the Venice Film Festival and Sundance Film Festivals, as well as Foundation Baylor in Basel, Switzerland. Franklin Sirmans, director of the Perez Art Museum, Miami, since 2015. Since coming to PAMM, he has overseen the acquisition of more than 1,000 works of art by donation or purchase. At PAMM, Franklin has pursued his vision of PAMM as the People's Museum, representing a Miami lens, by strengthening existing affiliate groups, such as the PAMM Fund for African American Art, and creating the International Women's Committee and the Latin American and Latinx Art Fund. Franklin has organized Purgatory 2017, and he was the co-curator of the World's Game Football and Contemporary Art in 2018. Prior to his appointment here at the Perez, he was the department head and curator of contemporary art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, LACMA, from 2010 until 2015. At LACMA, Sirmans organized Purgatory, Noah Purfoy, Junk Dada, Variations, Conversations in and around Abstract Painting, football, The Beautiful Game, Ends Exist, Ends and Exits, Contemporary Art from the Collection of LACMA, and the Broad Art Foundation. From 2006 to 2010, he was the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Manil Collection in Houston, where he organized several exhibitions, including Neo-Hoodoo, Art for a Forgotten Faith, Maurizio Cattelan, Is There Life Before Death, Vija Sirmans, Television and Disaster, 1964 to 1966, and from 2005 to 2006, Franklin was a curatorial advisory committee member at MoMA PS1. He was also the director of Prospect 3, New Orleans, from 2012 until 2014, and was awarded the 2007 David C. Driscoll Prize, administered by the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. He continues to write and contribute to the world of contemporary and modern art, making an impact in the world of art. So without further ado, I could go on, but I won't. Welcome to the stage, Franklin and Marco. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. I'm going to take my appendage off. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you, too, as usual.
Yeah, no, gosh, I'm having a weird experience sitting here looking at the work like this. It reminds me of the first time we started talking about the piece. And the first way that I experienced the piece, and I should say thank you to Vive for today and for the headsets that I hope everyone has had an opportunity to try. It's amazing. It's a different experience. It's, because the first time we started talking, you actually sent me part of the work via headset. And, this must have come, gosh, I don't know, maybe a few months into the pandemic. The idea of being at home was beginning to sink in all the time. The idea that not experiencing museums for quite a period of time was definitely a part of it, and going to a movie theater was definitely not going to be happening in the moment. So the first time I experienced the work that we're talking about, I was on my futon, probably in a prone position, and thoroughly enjoying myself. and I just realized that again, sitting here with this kind of display and thinking about the different ways in which the work plays out. That can take us in many different directions. So let us go back. Let us think a little bit chronologically first. Where did Heaven's Gate come from?
Well, Heaven's Gate I made during the lockdown. So basically, I've made 3 other video collages prior to this. I kind of created this technique in about 2008 with a piece called Civilization. I made 2 further works that expanded upon that piece. And then it's a very daunting project to jump into because it requires a tremendous amount of focus and attention, and it becomes like a stream of consciousness experiment where you're connecting and disconnecting images which may not be obviously belong together, but in some kind of psychological way they do belong together. And so I had the idea for Heaven's Gate, I think, in 2017, and then when the lockdown happened, suddenly there was a tremendous amount of time to be able to focus and to dedicate 100% of my attention to a new work in the video collage technique. So the idea had come a few years before, and then because of 2020 and living in a time of lockdown, pandemic, Trump administration, re-election campaign, there's that informed the psychology of the piece as well, because we were kind of bombarded with media every day. And I think the theme of the work, which is loosely based on the 7 levels of Purgatory by Dante, Purgatorio, came from the time capsule of living in this saturated media anxiety producing world of 2020. So it is definitely in the work.
There's a lot to talk about within that realm of metaphor and the relationship to being in that period that we've all experienced, and one that obviously is not over. You know, we are still wearing masks, and but tell us first, just so everybody understands, you use the term video collage. Just tell us a little bit about how you actually create the video collage.
Okay, well, it started, the first piece was called Civilization, I think 2008, and because my background is a film director, I directed Hollywood films before moving to New York from Los Angeles and starting an art practice. I made a work that commented on the idea of spectacle replacing content in film. So basically, and it's gone much further than that now, where many films seem almost interchangeable because they're made as franchises, sequels, all sorts of interchangeable elements of dialogue, visuals, art direction, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were to remove content and just replace it with spectacle and then create a hyper spectacle, so now you're taking hundreds of millions of dollars of production value and kind of combining it into a new format. That was the comment, basically. Like the way at the turn of the century theater had ships burning on stage to entertain people, film has similarly become, mainstream film has become mostly spectacle. And the video collage technique lended itself very well to removing characters from the original context and creating, at the time we didn't have GIFs, but these were essentially GIFs of characters trapped in time, forever repeating their choreography or movement or whatever dialogue they had. And all of that is removed, and we're only left with the kind of surrogate of that character and the associations between those characters. So originally it was about this comment on spectacle, and it still is with this piece. So there's a technical aspect of it, which has become more sophisticated. So since this is the fourth one, it's in a very high resolution. It's much more developed. And much more seamless than the first one. But the concept has always been the same, where it's like, what happens if you remove a work from its original context and create a new one?
Just curious, how many, when you say gifts, like how many different movies are touched upon in Heaven's Gate?
This one is about 800 films.
800 films. Yeah. And so we're talking about during the pandemic, I think obviously one of the overriding things for all of us has been isolation. Is this a work that you can make in isolation?
I think it's a work you can only make in isolation, because I once you've sketched it out, you really need to make these. If you look at it very closely, there's elements of juxtaposition there that are pure stream of consciousness. So it just comes from staying home, not having any kind of social life for an extended period of time, and really studying different films. And I was I think I was probably watching about 6 films a day when I was working on this, just to catch patterns because when you're working with sampled material, your canvas is really what's available, and you may have a recollection of a film you may have seen a long time ago, and then you watch it again, and it's completely different, but it may create another idea and another narrative. So then it's a question of when do you stop, when do you kind of trap the narrative which you have, and you decide this is the piece. And I think that happened towards the end of the lockdown, actually. But in answer to your question, it is almost necessary to kind of be intimate with the films in a way that's not interrupted or distracted from.
So it was a good thing for them.
Yeah. Isolation was a very good thing for this. Yeah.
And within that time period and with that context, a lot of the imagery you have worked with before. So just give us a sense of how much of it is intuitive versus how much is it about new research all the time.
Well, I think this one started with the milestones of it. So there's these 7 levels, Dante's Purgatory obviously being the historical reference. And then if you were to transpose that into a completely pop culture contemporary landscape. So this is also the story of capitalism in a way. So we start with the temptation, the Aladdin character in the cave section and underwater, and then there's this kind of prehistoric section, which is the formation of life, and then enlightenment, which is the section that's just passing us by now, and then that leads to industry and productivity and the American dream, and that leads to a kind of utopia of capitalism, and that leads to a kind of euphoric, bucolic kind of overload of energy and capitalism and all that. And I think that's very much the statement. I think this kind of empire teetering on the verge of excess, which is, I think, even more relevant now, probably because we thought when we came out of the pandemic, things would have reset. But they absolutely haven't. So I think there's references in there. Obviously, they're political at the top as well. Like there's the Capitol building exploding, which was actually put into the work before the riot. So, fact and fiction. I mean, 2020 was a really
pretty crazy,
bizarre year.
Yeah. Talk about some of those other kind of metaphors for the year. Just looking at the piece, and I've had the opportunity, of course, to be in and out of the piece for months, but I'm always seeing something new. Mm-hmm. And do you, when you think about the composition of each of those 7 levels, there's this kind of guiding light at the center that can help move the narrative forward.
Exactly.
Am I reading that correctly?
Exactly. That's the narrator for each section. So each section has a kind of narrator, a non-verbal narrator that gives you an anchor. And this time I ended up using a lot of samples from kind of post-war musicals. This idea of dealing with society trauma with escapist entertainment. So as you get closer to the top, you're really looking at these kind of Busby Berkeley extravaganzas, all these movies that were made after World War II, after the Great Depression, and elements that were meant to be distracting and take you out of your day-to-day.
Mm-hmm. And within that, again, like we're looking at the very beginning right now. Tell us about some of those images that we're seeing.
Well, the narrator at the beginning is from a movie called Under the Skin, which is a Jonathan Glazer film, which is quite interesting. And there's an ascension to it. So when this work exists as of 2 different versions of this work. One is a 360 VR experience where you levitate through the work. And as you probably saw in the Bank of America gallery, there's a more totemic presentation of the work, which is essentially a different storytelling. So you're looking at multiple levels, strata of the story. And in the immersive layer, you're levitating. So you're following this kind of proto-man character up through these levels, and then eventually you're ascending, but you're also descending into chaos.
Right.
So as you become more enlightened, the inverse, it starts to tip over about halfway through, and it becomes kind of overload of chaos.
And how, we're looking at it in different ways, but how did you come up with the totemic approach, especially because we talked about other ways of potentially thinking about the installation of the piece that would be more of a circular kind of installation that would relate a little bit more to what it's like with the headset. But in the end, we decided that we needed to do something very different.
Yeah, and I think that was actually based on our conversations. I think after we spoke a few months before the show, I decided maybe a completely different type of narrative would be interesting here, where it's more this kind of strata and totemic, as I call it now, and this idea of an endless loop. So rather than try to simulate the immersiveness of VR, which you really can't do anyway, why not present it in a way that's more of a window into our history and into our future?
You touched upon it a little bit. I mean, we've spoken about some of the specifics to the piece, but in general, your work, you mentioned coming out of a feature film experience, and I was thinking about this a lot recently, just like the ability to make things individually, the ability to make things in isolation. You have that as an artist in a way that you don't as a filmmaking artist. And how has that played out? I mean, gosh, we met in like 1998 or something.
At Exit Art, I think.
Yeah. How has, just give us a sense of the evolution of the work, and of course, take first the evolution.
I think the film, being a director, it's a very collaborative medium, and it's become increasingly business oriented because you're dealing with factors that have very little to do with what you're actually making. It's about the marketing and the idea of the financial, because a film you're spending a tremendous amount of money, of other people's money, so you're accountable to all sorts of mechanics that may have nothing to do with what you're actually trying to express. And I think when you're working in a canvas such as this, I was able to take some of the knowledge from film and some of the special effects knowledge, and I love working with technology, as you can see, and working in a much more specific canvas allows me not really to collaborate with anyone, which I prefer because I think you have the luxury of getting 80% of what your vision was, and on a film, I think you're lucky if you get 50% of what your vision is on film, and that's a good.
It's so interesting in that space. Just think about, in one way, someone could interpret the idea of moving from the more collaborative to the more individual artist alone in their studio. The presentation of that is often confined to a gallery or museum art installation space. But not unlike today, where we actually have 3 different modes happening at the same time of seeing the work, you've been very clear that you wanted the work to be positioned in a way that kind of relates to the mass audience that is associated with Hollywood filmmaking.
Yeah, and I've always loved site-specific installations. So I've worked with institutions in New York to do site-specific, and I think this, in a certain way, because of our conversation and the gallery and how to present it in that gallery, I think it took on different forms. So it has become a kind of agnostic. So it's a format agnostic piece. It can be a 360. It can be, like you see it behind you, as a film projector, or it can also be as the video sculpture, which is the totem. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that with different time-based work, especially with NFTs, and everybody was waiting for that.
Slow down.
To come up. I thought you were going to... So basically you're going to see more and more work that exists in the ephemera of different... So you're actually... it's software, and it can exist as a program, it can exist online, it can exist as a projection or as a VR installation.
But that is one of the things, that I find so attractive about the work, is that, I guess it was a year or maybe 2 years ago, a year ago, we had your descending staircase in the design district displayed on the wall of a very, for us, from Miami in the design district, a quite busy street. And that is, that was special. It was a really nice way to experience the work, especially at a time when December of 2020 was defined as kind of quiet and isolated. Or likewise, I was in New York at the Standard recently, and you get to experience the work in the elevators of that hotel. I think here as well. So the way that you use different contexts in which to explore the ideas that are at the core of the artwork, I think, is absolutely phenomenal.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, I hope, I think on one level it acts as, it's kind of a surrogate entertainment. This is commenting on, these pieces are commenting on entertainment itself. So I think the form should be accessible, and it should be inclusive, and it shouldn't be hierarchical like certain other pieces. I think it needs to be very inclusive. So I hope that's reflected by the different venues in the different areas. We're showing this also in London next year in a 360 space, which has it's about the size of this room, and it has an LED ceiling and walls, and you'll be inside a VR environment without a headset. So there's many different formats, and I see it as a site-specific kind of monument to what 2020 represented to me, basically.
Absolutely. And tell us a little bit about the title, because that does.
Oh,
play
yeah.
into
The
it.
title comes from Michael Cimino's film. I think it was 1980, called Heaven's Gate, where it was the first film that bankrupted a movie studio. So this is after Michael Cimino won an Academy Award for Deer Hunter. He had carte blanche to basically do whatever he wanted, and he went a little nuts and spent, I think, $120 million on.
In 1980.
Yeah, it's an insane amount of money. And there's actually a great book about that called Final Cut, about the making of that film. And it became one of the films that ended the auteur theory for directors in cinema. And after that film, certain authority and power was taken away from directors and given to producers. So, and that relates back to the concept of spectacle and mass entertainment. And what's happened since then is even more drastic. But that was kind of the tipping point, I think.
Yeah, and you alluded to that a little bit with talking about, the movies and series that are more or less defined by a production team as opposed to a storytelling director. Do you think that's going to change?
Well, I think it's going to be with streaming services now that as a result of the pandemic, films are now also kind of agnostic. They'll be streaming or on a movie theater. So I think the amount of content that's necessary for Netflix or Apple or whoever it is to survive and keep their subscriptions up is going to necessitate more and more material that's heavily researched.
Right.
That's not necessarily controversial. It's not necessarily ahead of its time, because that really doesn't suit the format. Right. The format is you want something that's of the moment, commenting on events that are happening now or conversation pieces. So I think the technology companies tend to, they're not known for their support of individual kind of expression, and I think it's going to become more generic. So I think, and it's already happened, I think if you look at Apple TV, you'll see a certain type of sensibility, and you look at Netflix, there's a certain type of sensibility, and I think it's very interesting because each one has its own audience and its own language and its own way of keeping you enticed,
You're so true, God, and thinking about it in the context of Netflix, there's a lot more material available if we think about the international distribution of material, but they all come, or each series comes with, 20 different translations, but it's the same story, regardless of where it comes from in the world. It's fascinating. Yeah. I have one other question before we open it up. Did you watch anything during the pandemic?
Well, I was watching all the films.
Aside from that,
I had virtually no time off. I was watching. I rediscovered a lot of '70s films like The 10th Victim and Network and Being There and Apocalypse Now. So I was actually focusing on that kind of era of extravagant, high production value visuals that were still analog. Because the thing about the collage is that it is very analog. Like a lot of the films are
actually putting it together.
Yeah, they're shot on film.
What is the Christopher Walken from? Again?
That's from King of New York.
Oh God.
Yeah, when he gets out of jail.
Yeah. I mean, the Christopher Walken that flows into the Leonardo DiCaprio.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we open it up?
Yeah.
Question, just raise your hand, but wait for the mic, so that way everyone can hear you and it goes to you. Testing.
I was curious about the music. Did you create the music? What the music wanted to achieve?
Well, that's a good question. The music is actually, in this piece, it's sampled from about 10 or 15 different sources, so it's not one piece of music. The previous pieces were a piece of classical music usually, and this one was more like tuning. I wanted it to feel like you were tuning different radio stations as you went up, so each section has its own theme. And the basis for the top section is actually, it sounds like tribal music, but it's actually a Neapolitan folk song, which I found. A Neapolitan folk song is what you're hearing near the top.
You know, that point where the big headdress.
Yeah, the vocals are from a Neapolitan folk song.
Hello, it's an honor to be here and watch this. Can you explain us how does this work technologically? I mean, when we watch this, you know, from this device, is the images are coming from this box, or it has some relationship with the screen that we were watching on the front?
No, they don't actually have a relationship, but what you have in your hand is actually the very latest technology for VR, which tracks your head movement to what you're seeing on the screen. So the reason it feels so immersive is because as you move your field of view, you're actually kind of inside that world. And these are the first, they're called the Vive Flow, and then the first glasses that are completely portable and self-contained. But it doesn't have a relationship to this. This is simply projected as we're speaking. But, and VR is becoming more, when I shot the first VR piece was about 6 years ago, and it used to be very low resolution. It used to give you a headache. You could only wear it for 3 minutes before you didn't feel good. And I think this is about 4th generation now, and it's getting, every year, the resolution's getting better, and it's getting much more portable as well.
Okay. But the film is inside this box?
Yeah, well, it's loaded into
Loaded
a computer inside the glasses, so it's all self-contained.
glasses.
So the little pack you have in your hand is actually a battery pack.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hey, I was just wondering if you could talk us through the process of, say, like one individual thing like King Kong, for example, how you sort of took that out of the film and processed that into a composite. And just secondly, I'm actually coincidentally working on the building you're exhibiting on in London, so looking forward to seeing that as well. Thanks.
Okay, so in each section has its own kind of narrator. So basically, what you just saw in Eden is from a movie called The Great Beauty, which was a scene where they parodied Marina Abramovic's performance art, and they had a character playing that. And then as you come up here, you have the character from Hugo, which is the first robot that can sign his signature, and then Christopher Walken, as we were saying. And then so each character gives you like an anchor point as you go from level to level. And in the VR version, you're looking at it in a completely different way because it's much more subjective. So you are, in the VR version, you're basically the character you see at the beginning, levitating. So you're actually levitating through these layers as a panoramic. But in installation that some of you may have seen in the gallery, you're looking at a kind of diorama of the different sections put together. So it's a very different context.
Thank you. And I was just wondering, so say for one element of it, so say for Christian Bale there, how long would it take you to take him out and put it into composite? So how long is it taking you for each individual element? Well,
the first and second video collages, we did it by hand, you know, at my studio. And then as they got more images and more content and more complex, it actually has to be sent somewhere. It's called rotoscoping. So there are people who do that frame by frame by frame, and it gets sent away, and then you get it back, and they're already cut out.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
So I loved your piece, and it made my brain explode, and it's probably still exploding. So, you know, I was interested in your comment about the generative chronology of the piece set in the 70s. And I was thinking about the ways in which those filmmakers were the first generation of film school trained or autodidacts like Peter Bogdanovich. So people who are immersed in film history. And when I was looking at the piece, I was very aware of the meta-commentary of film history, the way that you kind of walked up through Expressionism, kind of the modernist flourishes of 30s and 40s, supposed to be Berkeley, and then kind of moved into classical Hollywood, and then, you know, the kind of meta-commentary on classical Hollywood that emerges in the 70s, 80s, and so on. So I was interested in your, in the ways in which you try to develop a meta-commentary on cinema history.
Well, I think we actually, one of the versions had genres. It was divided into, so the genres were more specific to each section. So one was told as a Western, one was told as a science fiction film, and then it became very limiting, and I think you lost the narrative that way. But some of the elements from that are still within each section. So when you say that there's a progression as you get up towards the top, I think that may be from the way it was built, because the top was essentially Hollywood musicals was the top, and then most of that remained. But the rest of it is much more interspersed now.
I think we have a mic coming.
We have a microphone for you.
Sorry, I have to come all the way across here.
Yeah, I echo the last gentleman's statement. It's mind-blowing. I'm excited from a technical perspective and have two questions for you. What resolution did you create? Is this frame resolution? And it's clear that the art that you're creating is sort of pushing the limits of not only HTC, you know, the HTC, but all head-mounted displays. They're getting better, but in their limitations to render such resolution. So my second question is, if the sky were the limit, are you like looking to 8K? I imagine this is 4. What medium would be ideal for you to optimally express yourself in?
Well, this one, simply because it's so dense, and you need to see all the kind of fine details in the background. This is 8K, but you're seeing it in just HD, I think, up here. So it's actually 4 times the resolution, but it gets very complicated to render. And as you say, the technology in VR isn't quite at the level yet to display the resolution at which this was made, but it's getting better all the time.
Yeah, it's probably the best example showcasing where all head-mounted displays, whether it's Oculus or HP or HTC, any of them, sort of top out. And I'm working with a small company that develops technology that can help them computationally produce a breakthrough. I'd be interested in using this as an example to technical decision makers globally on how they can step up and hit the next bar that the optics alone just aren't able to achieve.
Great. Well, we should talk about that after. Yeah, wonderful. Great. That's cool. Excellent.
Hello?
Yeah, there it is.
So I was wondering, would you be, not as a trend or anything like that, but would you be willing to sell shorter reels of it as NFTs or something regarding the topic?
Oh, no, this piece, it was made pre-NFT. I mean, that's something that I think a lot of the work that I'm approaching in that realm is made specifically for that format. And I see it as a medium, you know, I don't really see it as I see it more as a fluid kind of dynamic medium, and sometimes it's better to, I think the interesting thing about NFTs is this kind of generative smart contracts where the work itself changes over time, and things you can't necessarily do in a gallery or a museum that the technology allows you to do. And this was made prior to that. This version of this, anyway, was made prior to that. Oh, one more. We've got lots of questions.
2 more. You want 2 more? You okay? Cool. That's good.
Hello. So I was just wondering, if you're taking images from 800 plus movies, like, did you run into copyright obstacles, or like, is there a library of which you can pull these from, and just like the intellectual property of it?
Well, that's a very good question because we're talking to Fortnite to show this inside the video game Fortnite, and we had to go through a whole legal clearance system. And fortunately, because the loops are so short and they're sharing screen with so much material, it falls under fair use, and it's clearable. It's actually, they've shown excerpts of it on BBC and Sky TV without. So in this context, obviously, it's a big gray area, and you're probably fine regardless of what how long it's on the screen. But when you're showing it a clip in a video game, let's say, it becomes much more complicated. So we have had it looked at by lawyers to determine that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you so much for the presentation and the treat of having the discussion. I was quite interested, especially in this idea of like looping, and the fact that as an immigrant, I moved here also when I was 13. I'm also an artist that rejects verbal language, so it's clear that you're using all these visual images to create another sort of paragraph or book or film.
Yeah.
But on first, even thinking about this notion of the American dream that after a while really is a misnomer to what is a US machine, it's interesting how time plays into this, also with the VR experience, because we're moving on a vertical level, but clearly the layering is this horizontal level. And it makes so much of a difference to watch it 4, 5, 6 times, because at first point, it's really like eye candy, very much like the American dream. But after a while, it gets so nauseating. And it really reminds you or sort of triggers, it triggers a lot of issues and problems and horrific things or the lack of reflection that one sees in themselves. So when about time, I noticed that we were talking, it's 5 minutes. Is that important to you though? That is there a way when you show it that you insist that people watch it several times? Or have you ever thought about saying, no, the film is actually 20 minutes, but actually it's just looped 4 times in order to go through that emotional switch? Because you're clearly very critical. At the beginning, I was like, ugh, but now with hearing you as well, you are very critical in the same way that I'm thinking about it, and I think that's important.
That's a very good question, actually. I think the number of times you would want to view it is baked into the density, because you really can't see everything the first time. So the ideal number of times, maybe 3 or 4 times, depending on the person. But I think the criticality is really not. I mean, I try not to really editorialize anything in my work. You just present it, and if it happens to have, as you say, this dual side where it's very seductive and candy-coated, but it reveals under the surface there's obviously something more menacing and dark, that's great. I mean, that's definitely part of the intention, but it's not. Hopefully, it's not immediately apparent, and maybe that's why viewing it more than once is interesting.
Thank you, Marco.
You.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you
all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Franklin. And thank you, Vive Arts, for putting this together. Appreciate it.